we're going to talk about embedding accessibility into code reviews. This is kind of a tips and tricks from me sort of approach to things. This is by no means going to be a checklist for you, unless you want it to be, right? So I'm just going to share some things I have learned over my time as an accessibility professional, accessibility consultant, and I've spread the gap between design and development. Most recently, I am a developer primarily. But I am Christina Adams. I am a senior digital accessibility engineer at Siteimprove. Won't mention it again, but it's really lovely to be here with you all. I wanted to start, if I can be on the right screen, there we go. I wanted to start with setting some, intentions for what we're going to do here today, because code can be intimidating. I understand that. So I want to share common code checks for code reviews. This would be somewhere in the process of your product development cycle before your product or your enhancements get to production. We're trying to catch things early, reducing errors out in your public facing website to lower the negative experiences some of your users may experience if we have accessibility errors in our code. I also want to, I understand, I want us to understand collectively that we won't find everything. This is not a perfect science. There's always gaps, right? So we're going to do everything we can to catch things early, but understand there still will be errors. The goal, I think, in the long run is reducing those things over time. So we just have less to deal with, less user impact, negative user impact. And then we realize that not everyone here on this lovely event codes. Absolutely. So this might not be in your day-to-day life. So I want to share it in a relatively common language. Hopefully, we will talk through code. That is just a given. However, I also want to describe that user experience of errors, for errors, to hit at the why we are finding them and trying to address them before they get to production. I understand this is probably not in everybody's day-to-day, but I am certain you will find pieces of this that you will overhear, that will be part of your process, that you might spark an idea for you to say, hey, wait a minute, did we check this for this code for accessibility? Did we check that form field? Whatever, it might help the full product process as a whole, because I am certain you will come across some of these topics in your experience. I'm hopeful anyway. And then transparency, I have way too many slides. I got excited about this topic. So we will get to what we get to. And there is a link on the website for my slides. I will also caveat all of this by saying I am fighting a cold, and I'm going to do my best to not cough on the live mic, but apologies if I do. So with that, I cough on mic, but let's get started. We're on a topic where every code-based conversation about accessibility should start, in my opinion, is semantic HTML. Again, if you're not a coder, what does that mean? Semantic just means meaning. So creating meaningful HTML, using meaningful elements in our HTML that prepackage some of the information that will be delivered to your end user. That is the goal, right? We should always use semantic HTML where appropriate. And that is, there are semantic HTML elements and there are generic elements. We want to, use them appropriately, make good decisions about where those things are going, and we'll cover some common pitfalls in that too. All right. So semantic elements, what do we mean? We're going to start really simple here. Semantic elements should take priority. So when you are completing a code review, when you are looking at something to validate if it is implemented correctly, you want to start asking yourself questions about what the functionality of those elements are. And if we're using generic containers, is there a semantic element that should be used instead? I won't even give you an option. So there's also, I'm not going to go too deeply into automated checks that you can build into your pipeline or use in your browser extensions, things of that nature. I feel like that's a talk on its own. But there are ways of tricking automated tests. As coming from a company that creates a tool for automated tests, I can tell you you can trick it very easily. So we want to catch those things before they get out, because they will not be a good user experience for anybody. So, and it will cause code maintenance problems really in the future. You're just making more work for yourself in the long run. So we're going to search our code base for when we're doing a code review for some of these common issues I still see every day as I'm reviewing sites out there in the world. We have, our first code example here at the top is a div with a tab index of 0 applied to it. And the HTML text inside of that is submit. Now, div is a generic container. It doesn't have any meaning to the end user. So if I come across this in a code review, I need to recommend a change. You should be using a button element. This is clearly something that is interactive. So we need to use the appropriate semantic HTML. Now, the next example below it is, again, a div with a tab index equal or set to 0. But we've applied a role of button onto that element. Same element, it says submit inside of it. This is one of those I've tricked perhaps one or two of those automated accessibility checks, because technically now we have modified a generic element to be a role, to have the correct semantic role. But this is too much work. Like, this is going to cause debt in our system. It could cause usability issues for your end user, because there's a lot more things you would have to add to this to make it fully functional in the way a user is going to expect. So again, recommend the same change. Just use a semantic HTML button here. That should take priority over doing too much work and adding ARIA implementations like roles and things of that nature. And then below that, this might still get caught in an automated check, this example, but it is something, again, I have seen out there in the world. But we have a div, again, generic container with a role set to list. And then inside of that div, we have list item elements, LI elements in HTML. We have 3 of them in this example. This is a little bit cheating, and it's not going to function like you expect, right? So again, we're going to make the recommendation, use an unordered list element. It is semantic or ordered list element, depending on what you're trying to achieve here with this list. Use the semantic HTML. That's always preferred, right? So first thing we want to check for, are we using semantic HTML in the appropriate places? We'll dive a little deeper into some of these specifically in future slides here, if we get to them. I need to hide this panel really quick. There we go. Okay. Too much information. Okay, there we go. So in the same line of conversation with semantic HTML, one of the continuing troublesome places in reviewing code, especially, but sites in general, for accessibility practices is forms. I have no idea why this is still a problem, but it is. I think there's just a lack of understanding maybe about what these semantic elements do. So again, if you have a form in the document you are reviewing, you are code reviewing, or multiple forms, pay close attention to these areas. This is still a place where, for whatever reason out there, we are still having issues with implementing them correctly in an accessible way. So the first thing you should do if you have a form is use a form element, right? This is pretty common to be forgotten about, because we can use JavaScript client side to submit information from input fields, things of that nature. But why should we use a form element? This is a landmark. Forms are landmarks, and it is a quick way for assistive tech users to navigate through the content of your site. I can skip directly to the forms in the site. It's important to use that landmark. And if you have multiple landmarks, it would require some naming conventions. So again, something to pay close attention to. You'd want to put a name, accessible name on the form. Again, accessible name is something we will dive into very, very quickly. But okay, so we have a form element in our example code here. Very simple, semantic. everything is going to parse this correctly. We don't have to do any more work. Perfect, right? And then the next thing that is almost always missing from forms in any way, in any review I've done, is a submit button, shockingly. So again, we can do a lot of work with JavaScript to submit forms, submit information, take that, parse it, put it out to a, an endpoint to submit it into our database, for instance. Providing the correct submit form, the semantic submit button, I should say, is really important for a couple of reasons. Primarily, it's important to let users have control of submitting their data, right? Automatic submits are extremely jarring. It causes you to question if that information was correct or not. So again, use your submit button. There's two examples here on the page. We have an input type submit with a value that would say submit the form in that button element or that input type submit that would show up in the browser. And we also have a button type submit with the HTML text of submit inside of that. Both work. You only need one. I just wanted to show there's two separate ways to do this or implement this correctly. But again, giving users control over when their data is submitted through your site is extraordinarily important. It is also important for people who get confused about where they are, if they're done or not. Submit button makes that really obvious and expected by the end user. And that's, I think, the important takeaway for everybody. The only one that I would say that might be a caveat is that auto suggest kind of approach in like a search bar. I would still say, yes, you can auto suggest things. It might fill in the search bar, but to really submit that and make that choice, there should be some sort of control given to the end user. A submit button is perfect for that. So I'd still recommend doing it. You might want to discuss that on your own internal teams, perhaps. The next one, still one of the most troublesome spots in any site that has a form in it, is properly associated labels to form fields. So again, why we need to describe to the end user if they are sighted, if they are using assistive technology, if whatever they're using voice control, there's any user persona this is important for, because providing a properly associated label to your field provides direction about what you are supposed to do there. It provides that accessible name to the field so that people know exactly what they're supposed to type in, right? So two ways of doing this that I prefer, and you should again talk with your teams about what your standard is. First way is explicitly connecting a label to an input field. So we have a label element with a for attribute, and that for is referencing an ID of field 1 inside the value. And then the HTML text in that label is first name. We have an input field with an ID below that that has an ID of field 1, and it's type text to describe what type of input it is, right? But that connection is being made between the label and the input field through an ID reference. Again, really explicit, where we have to reference a specific ID in the label to pull those two things together, make a relationship between those two things. And then another check that we'll go over a little bit more thoroughly is IDs have to be unique within the page. I know WCAG 2.2 is removing it. Yes, I could go on and on about that and I won't, but IDs need to be unique for specific reasons that we'll get into. But this is one of the limitations of this type of implementation. You will have to have unique IDs on every single input field in your form on one document. So think about that. But as you're doing your code review, this is one way of knowing those two things are connected together programmatically, and will describe to the end user exactly what they should be doing. The second way, in our second example here, is an implicit relationship between the label and input field. The label element in HTML, again, semantic element of label, has the text of first name inside of it, And the end tag for that label element is actually below our input field. So the input is a child element of the label. Because it's wrapping it, those two things are directly related. They're connected together through that implicit parent-child relationship. So again, this is a little easier to implement. It's maybe a little more difficult to read when you are doing a code review, but this has less limitations to it about ID references and such. So again, look for these things. Now somebody's going to say, well, wait, I can put an ARIA label on my input field and that provides an appropriate label. Yes, it does. It does, but it will not be visible to the end user. So again, you want to make absolutely sure that that is a specific choice your team has made and that some users will be impacted by not providing a visual label for a field. It's not a best practice to do that. You really do want the visual label there. But again, you can do it, yes. I wouldn't recommend it, right? So push back maybe and say we need a visible label because it actually makes it easier for everybody to use and understand what information I'm having to give. Okay, wonderful. Checking my time. I'm going too slow. Someone pick it up. And then the use of field sets. This is one that might be new information to some folks out here, but a semantic field set element with a legend is a way of grouping similar fields, input fields, most commonly in radio and checkbox groups, right? So we have a semantic field set element that wraps our legend and two radio button options here with our labels appropriately assigned to each input field directly. And the legend provides overarching label for the group of those things. So they all kind of roll, all the options, radio options roll up into the legend. Now, some things to watch out for in your code review is that the legend has to be the very first element in the field set. So that's a quick check you can do, just glancing through your code base. And you want to make sure that it's descriptive, like all labels, right? Is it telling users what they should be doing? Important. So again, could go further into this, but I wanted to bring this up as a commonly missed implementation when we talk about forms specifically and semantic elements within forms. Okay, so ARIA, we're going to talk about it a little bit because this is a pretty big problem in a lot of sites. I do 2-hour workshops on ARIA. I'm not clearly going to go into the weeds too far into this, but when we're doing code reviews, we want to make sure that our use of ARIA is limited. It's necessary, right? That's the goal here. We don't want to start putting ARIA on everything. It makes very bad things happen, both for the end user, but also for like you maintaining it into the future. So, excuse me, some quick checks to do here that I always perform when I am doing a little code review for a colleague is searching for role. So I will, take the pull request that person has provided. I will open it up into my text editor of choice, and I will just do a search all for role. It's a little aggressive, I understand, but I do this because I want to see where we are using these ARIA roles and if they're necessary or not. So I have a big code example here. It's a kind of full document HTML view. I have in my text editor searched for role equals in this case. And I've highlighted through the code that's available on the screen where role equals exists in the code. I can just glance through this now that they're all highlighted and say, oh, okay, we're using a tab list, right? An ARIA tab list. Wonderful. This is actually a composite widget that does not have an HTML semantic cousin, right? we don't have HTML that can properly accomplish this in the HTML spec. So using this is appropriate in this case. But I want to make sure that in this code review that all the right roles, states, and properties exist in this component or composite widget, as ARIA states. So I would probably, at this point, if I'm not super familiar with this, pop up the ARIA patterns guidance document that's out on the W3C and compare them, right? Just straight up compare their examples to this. I probably want to check some things in the browser running this code as well to just make sure that is functioning in line with what the ARIA specs suggest, what the expected user experience is, right? And all the roles, states, and properties are there and being toggled appropriately. So again, this is a lot of undertaking, I understand, but every single time I do a code review, we are often missing something about these more complex composite widgets that are described in ARIA. So we just want to catch those things because that will have a negative user impact. These things, this is the part of ARIA that is important to do correctly, and that it exists here because it's describing really complex user interaction. Another ARIA thing I will search for while we're on the subject is ARIA label and ARIA labeled by. These give names, accessible names to elements. There are a lot of issues surrounding these, and in my opinion, they are overused pretty readily. So I think people get excited and have all the best intentions when they start coding that, oh, ARIA gives us accessible websites and I should use it everywhere. They get excited about that. I mean, I don't want to squash your excitement about it. However, there's a time and a place for ARIA. The first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. I'm certain that's already come up in the chat already. I haven't even looked, but I'm certain it did. But we want to be absolutely sure we are using ARIA label and ARIA label by in specific situations where an accessible name does not already exist, right? Again, most overused ARIA in my opinion, and most incorrectly used in my opinion. So what do? I again take the pull request, put it into my text editor, and just search all for ARIA dash. And that can be problematic, so you might need to do the full word ARIA dash label by or ARIA dash label to find them correctly. Again, highlight them all on your screen and double check. Is this an appropriate use of it? Is it implemented correctly? Am I getting what I expect out of it, right? Am I overriding meaningful content with ARIA label? And again, I have a future slide that will dig into that a little bit. But isn't that annoying? I keep doing that, but don't worry, we'll get there. The code example here on the page is an article that is highlighted in this larger HTML document. We have a link that goes to article 1, and it has ARIA dash labeled by that is set to article heading 1, all one word. That is a reference to an ID that is on a heading that is further up in the document. That ID matches, it is valid. I want to make sure it's not hidden, so I would probably run this in my browser as well to double check this. And then we want to make sure that it's pulling in the correct and expected accessible name, right, for that. ARIA labeled by, again, makes that connection between that heading text and the link so that it pulls the text of the link down to the accessible name of the link that does not have, in this case, any visible text in it. Again, that could be a problem for a lot of users. You might want to ask some questions about that one too in your code review, because visible text is important to a lot of people. But at least we know the ARIA label by is working appropriately. It is set to an ID reference, which is the only value that it can take. Excuse me one second, I'm gonna cough. Okay, back. Following that is a button element that has a class of icon export. So it's clearly a visual icon that is displayed as the content of that button, which may be the case for the link above it as well. And we have applied ARIA dash label to it of string value of export document. If I'm looking at this code review, I want to make sure, one, that ARIA label value is meaningful. It describes what is going to happen when that button is activated. And I want to make sure it's human readable. I can't tell you how many times I see people smash words together or hyphenate everything. And that becomes a really negative user experience. So ARIA label is a string. It's human readable. It's a short phrase that you put in there. ARIA labeled by is an ID reference. Just want to verify that those things are implemented correctly in your code review. So again, ARIA labeled by has this additional kind of check that's going to be on top of it as well. Whoops, I'm in the wrong screen again. Okay, ARIA labeled by again has this additional check that we're going to have to do if this starts popping up in the code base that you're reviewing. ARIA label by takes an ID, like I mentioned. IDs have to be unique within the document, like it or not. So in the code example here, we have 3 section elements: semantic, HTML, great. Because there's multiple of these and they're landmark roles, they need to have an accessible name associated with them. So we have applied ARIA-labeled by, and it's set to section heading, which is supposed to be referencing the nested child heading in each of the sections with an ID of section heading. So yes, we are associating it with an existing ID that's in the document. However, you will notice each section and heading inside of each section has the same ID. So this would fail. And I'm going to get to that. We're going to dig into that when we talk about the accessibility tree, which is my favorite part, and I need to make sure I have time for it. So this is a problem. We would have to, again, flag this in our code review. IDs have to be unique. If this is the way we want to go, we would have to make those IDs unique in order for this to accurately describe those section accessible names to the end user. More on that soon. And I will say just quickly that the outcome of this problem is going to be that each of the sections have an accessible name of chapter 1, which is a problem because that is not true, right? So we're giving bad information to our end users. Each section would be called section 1 because of the nature of an ID having to be unique in the document. It would only find the very first one and never go beyond that. Problem, right? So something we need to check for if this is in our code review implementation. And the last ARIA that I will mention very briefly, because again, I could probably do 2 hours on this also, is ARIA live and live roles. The only thing I will mention about this is that yes, ARIA live is a strength of ARIA. It is what creates an announcement to the user when something dynamically has changed within the live region. Specifically. So it's like a notification to the end user to go check something out. There's an error, there's a new message, something loaded onto the screen, something that did not require a page refresh or reload. That is where we use ARIA Live. What we want to check for in our code reviews, again, you can search for the ARIA-live property. You could search for the specific roles of status and alert, which are the most used ones, just to find them in the document quick. We want to make sure that they are limited in use. We only want a couple of these maximum in a document. Otherwise, we are going to annoy the user to all end. There will be too much information all the time. It's going to be disruptive and interrupt them potentially. So we want to make sure it's very limited. We also want to make sure that that ARIA live region, so the specific region that has the live property or role on it, is summary content. It just gives you a highlight of what has changed. It does not include, for instance, the entire page of search results or the entire page that got loaded, new content that got loaded into. We do not want that entire document to be inside of a live region. Summary content. And that we are using the correct type of notification. This is an important one because there's a lot of confusion around ARIA Live in general. Totally understandable, by the way. However, I want to make sure we're using the right type of notification for the user because they have different outcomes for the user. Our first example in code here is a div that has ARIA-live set to polite and ARIA-atomic is set to true. And that is a div that wraps a paragraph in this case. The paragraph says search results : 5. I would assume this is a notification space. After I search for something, I get it's reloading those search results into the current page without a page refresh. So that search results number gets updated with JavaScript, with client-side JavaScripting. This is a good implementation, in my opinion. It is a summary content. It is ARIA Live set to polite. Excuse me again. Which is the setting that will announce that change to the user in a polite way. It waits for a graceful place to make that announcement to the end user when that user's idle and not interacting with something actively. So this is great because it's supplementary information. We still want the notification to happen, but it's not urgent, right? You can accomplish the exact same thing with that div. Next example, it's a div with role set to status. Role status combines ARIA Live Polite and ARIA Atomic True together in one convenient role. So again, check for that as well in case that is the way your team is implementing it. I would say also pick one. Pick one unless there's a really good reason why you want to set all the ARIA Live properties on the manually. The roles are generally easier. They're a little more easier to understand what they're doing and the user outcome too. So pick one, stick with that, in my opinion. So again, you might want to check your patterns if you keep kind of like a component library or something. And then our last example, we have a div with a role set to alert. And in this case, it is wrapping a paragraph that says error, invalid email address. So again, I would assume some sort of client-side JavaScript has run on a form, clearly. Something about the email address field, the value that was typed in there by the user is incorrect. We need to notify the user of that, and no page refreshes happen. We want to notify the user that there's an error, and they kind of have to deal with it right away in order to submit their information correctly. So role alert is the correct role here. That would be if you wanted to set ARIA Live to assertive and ARIA Atomic True. Those are the properties that are wrapped and packaged into that role. No need to be redundant on them. Again, all things we need to verify if these exist. This is a big problem if we do it incorrectly for end users. So again, pay close attention to ARIA Live. It's valuable. It's a valuable task within your code review process to take a look at these things, make sure the user is getting the best experience possible. Okay, so my favorite part. Often when you're doing a code review, you're going to run the app or the page in your browser as part of that to double check all the layouts correct and things like that. I always use the accessibility tree when I'm doing code reviews or if I'm verifying things within the document, the page. It is probably my favorite tool. And this is something that we can access in DevTools in both Chrome and Firefox and probably other browsers. I prefer Chrome. So my examples will be from the Chrome DevTools panel in the browser. And there's an accessibility tab that displays the accessibility tree. And what is this? For those of you who aren't familiar with this, the accessibility tree is essentially just, oops, there we go. Is essentially just the DOM structure at its core. It's the HTML and all the parent-child relationships that happen down that HTML page. And it communicates roles, states, properties, and accessible names. So it gathers those things we talked about in that semantic HTML conversation we already had. It gathers those up and puts them into this tree along with any of the other text content or generic containers. And this is the basis of the API that assistive technology uses to interface with and describe these elements out to the end user. So if we open the accessibility tree in DevTools, we're getting a little snapshot of what is going to be communicated to our end users who are using assistive technologies. And I think this is huge because I don't know about you, but I am not a tester. I'm not a screen reader expert. I probably never will be. So I could do more damage doing screen reader testing because I'm not as familiar with all the steps and settings and user preferences that get set and expectations, right? I want to leave that to an expert. I want to leave that to a person with a disability who uses that every day in their everyday life, right? I'm not the technology expert on that front. I want to leave it to them, right? So I can get a snapshot in this accessibility tree of exactly what's going to be transferred to that assistive tech. And that assistive tech, depending on what brand you're using, depending on what tool it is, will interpret that however it does. That's out of our control. That device is going to do what it does with this information. But if I make sure all my roles, states, and properties, accessible names, etc., are showing up correctly in the accessibility tree, I have a pretty high level of confidence everything's going to go correctly. Still not 100%, but it's at least the best I can do with my development tools, right? So my examples here on the page before I move on. I have a very old Siteimprove website homepage, and that's rendered in the browser on the left. On the right, I have the snapshot of the accessibility tree that shows up in Chrome DevTools. And I can see that the title of the page, the web area, is Siteimprove Software Digital Presence. There's 2 generic containers, which are probably styling just divs. Then it's followed by a main element. That is a landmark. That's great. We need to use that in order to make sure that content is in the right landmark. We have 3 generic containers. And then inside of that, we have a heading that says achieve your digital potential, a paragraph, a link that says book time to talk with us, link, get a free site audit, and generic container again. So what am I looking at? This is a description of the roles of each of the elements in the HTML document. If it's generic, that means it has no meaning. Nothing's really going to be communicated to the end user unless there's like text content in it, basically. Where we see heading, paragraph, link, those are the roles that are in our semantic HTML. And the text that shows up, especially for link there, that is the book, the time to talk with us is the accessible name of that link, which will be communicated when a user focuses on that with whatever tool they're using. That will be announced to them so they know if they should activate it or not, right? So this is a pretty huge tool. If you have questions about if things are going to be communicated correctly, so you don't have to open up a screen reader right away, you can do a little troubleshooting here within your code review first. I always recommend that. I wanted to give an example of the accessible name situation. Check my time. Yeah, okay. First example here, we have a native HTML implementation of a button. And we have highlighted this in Chrome DevTools, opened up the accessibility panel. And we can see in that we have a role of button in the accessibility tree, role of button that says submit your answers. That's a good start. We can see that there's an ARIA attributes space in there, and it says no ARIA attributes have been applied. Good, probably. And then we have computed properties, and this is where we can actually see where that accessible name is coming from. This is huge too. And just to make sure we're not doing extra work overriding a bunch of stuff. In this case, we see name, submit your answers. ARIA labeled by is not specified. Our ARIA label is not specified. There's no from label there, but we have contents of submit your answers. So we know that accessible name for that button is being delivered by the HTML content of the element. Perfect. That's the ideal situation, right? Great, check. Like past that, move further into your code review. There's also more information there too about role of button. We have invalid user entry, which wouldn't be relevant here, focusable and focused. So we get a couple of states too, along with that. Second example on the same screen here, we have the ARIA implementation of a accessible name. So we have a button element again. This is an icon button. Icon of submit is a class, so I would assume that. We have an ARIA label set to submit your answers, and no HTML text is inside this button. So again, I look down into my accessibility tree. We see button, submit your answers. We see there's an ARIA attribute. ARIA label is set to submit your answers. And that accessible name calculation is submit your answers and is coming from the ARIA label. Wonderful. And the correct role is being communicated. Perfect. So we can double check that our ARIA label makes sense without having to open up a screen reader. We can see exactly what will be communicated out to assistive tech. One of my favorite tricks right here. And then just for fun, let's look at our example again of those 3 sections that all had ARIA labeled by that was referencing an ID that was duplicated on the page. This is where this would pass most automated checks. It would probably get dinged in an automated check system for regions with the same name, right? Multiple regions with the same name. So that might be your first clue. And then you'll open up your code review and you'll say, well, all of them have an ARIA labeled by, so what's the deal? Next step is to check that ID. because as we can see, it's the same example, 3 sections, all of them referencing ARIA labeled by to the section heading ID, which is the nested heading level 2 inside of each section, which is the same ID in every section, right? So I've highlighted in DevTools, now in dark mode, I don't know why I switched, but highlighted the second section element, open up my accessibility panel, and look at the accessibility tree. And I can see that it is a region, which is the implicit role of section, landmark role. And the name of that region is chapter 1, but the child heading is chapter 2. So there's clearly a conflict happening here. We need to figure it out. We need to suggest a change in our code review here because we're giving bad information out to the end user. So again, we can see that that's being set by ARIA labeled by, referencing section heading ID. Name is chapter 1, and we can see that that is from the heading level 2 with the ID of section heading and the text of chapter 1. Why is that happening? IDs by the HTML spec need to be unique within the document. The HTML document is parsed from top to bottom, always, never changes. Because IDs have to be unique within the HTML spec, all the other things follow that rule. So it will find that very first heading, level 2, with that ID of section heading. It will take that text and apply it to anywhere that that ID is a reference point. It will never go beyond that. So again, double check for this. This one trips people up a lot. Duplicate ID is still very relevant, even though it might not be a WCAG criteria anymore soon, someday. But definitely something you have to dig a little further in. I can tell you from experience that this accessibility panel is so helpful with this. I use it all the time. So, all right, cool. Next example, and so now we're gonna get a little technical, I'm sorry. I mean, this was already pretty technical, but I did wanna mention this accessible name calculation. One of the issues we run into, especially with ARIA, only with ARIA really, is that ARIA label and label by, again, zooming back to a previous slide here, very problematic, overused often, a lot of misconception about it. ARIA label and label by are extremely destructive. I will leave it at that. No. I have an example here of a very good example of a very bad implementation that, again, we want to highlight and politely tell whoever developed this to change it. We have a button element in our HTML that's highlighted. We have set aria-label to cancel. We have aria-label by set to form heading, which is referencing the heading level 2 above it that says profile form. And we have HTML text of submit inside of that button. What do you think the name of that button is for anybody who is using assistive technology and not referencing the visual interface? Right. If we look at our accessibility panel, it will tell us, right? That name calculation is now profile form, which is being brought in by the ARIA labeled by, referencing the heading that is above it in the document. In this case, doesn't matter where it is, but it's that ID reference of ARIA labeled by that takes priority over everything else. This is a problem because you're providing 2 separate experiences. Visual users will see submit because that's HTML text in the button. Assistive tech users will hear or read profile form. Voice dictation users will not know the name of this button because the off-screen text, the text that is not visible, the actual accessible name of that element is not what is visually represented on the screen. Huge problem, right? So why is this happening? This all comes down to the accessible name calculation. Not going to get too deep into it, but we can see it displayed here in the accessibility panel, where we can see the name of that button is profile form, and that is being brought in by the ARIA label by, which is displayed above it. At the top, it wins. It's at the top of the pile. It's king of the mountain, right? King or queen of the mountain. That is overriding the ARIA label of cancel. So no one will ever hear it using assistive technology. And both of those are overriding the HTML contents of that button that would be submit. So HTML content is displayed visually. It's being overridden by ARIA label of cancel, which is being overridden by profile form. Users who are getting their information through the accessibility API, any assistive tech will not ever hear submit, unless they go character by character, perhaps. But when they focus on that button, they will not hear submit as the name of that button. Huge problem. So again, this is why I'm trying to summarize why I think it's extremely important in our process to look for some of these implementations in the code review, because if this got out into production, so it'd have a huge impact, very big negative impact on our end users, especially who use assistive technology, so much so that they probably cannot use this form, right? That's huge. That's going to cause a complaint. That's going to cause really negative feelings about you and your company. So please do incorporate some of this into your process, at least be aware of it when you're doing your code reviews as well. One more thing in this accessibility tree talk, and then we could maybe get some questions. I see a couple. One more thing here is ignored. So often you will run your automated checks. Now there's a couple new ones from the ACT group that might catch this. Focusable content is in a hidden element. I never get the words right, but essentially that. However, this is one that often slips by in automated checks and causes huge amounts of problems for users. But some container is hidden. This so I guess the thing that should trigger this check in your accessibility tree is either you see a lot of new errors suddenly, something's going on, or you see no errors, which is maybe more disturbing, right? So this might trigger this. We want to double check. So we go find a semantic element in our document. In this case, we have highlighted the heading level 2, just really generically inside the main content of the page. I opened up my accessibility panel, and I see right at the top that yes, we're in this test page, but that element, that heading level 2 is ignored. Ignored means not accessible. That means it is not communicated through the accessibility API. It is not communicated to assistive technology. There is a little bit of a potential that it will. Some user agents will still communicate some information. I'm not going to get into it, but we need to find out why that is not being communicated and if that is appropriate or not, because there's good reasons to hide things in your page, right? But if you're hiding, in this case, the main content of the page, this is a problem because nothing will be communicated to users in the accessibility API. So I see that this is ignored. I need to figure out what is hiding it from users. This could be ARIA hidden. This could be a CSS of display none. This could be CSS visibility hidden, excuse me. All of this means is that it removes that element from the accessibility tree. It removes it out. It is not communicated to through the API. So this accessibility panel is super helpful in that. I can see in the computed properties that accessibility node not exposed. That's how they put it. And then in this case, it does tell me ARIA hidden is set on an ancestor of main. So I can look in my code. Sure enough, the main element in HTML has ARIA hidden set to true, and this is going to be a problem. So we need to make sure, again, in our code reviews, this might come up where suddenly something just doesn't seem right if you're looking at it, or it's not getting, it comes back as a QA test or something that that content wasn't accessed. I like to start here with some of that. That accessibility tree will be super useful to you in this sort of analysis. All right, so I have, of course, more. We go to 410, is that correct? So why don't we open up for questions if that's all right? And then if we need to, we can continue on.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing all the great information, Christina. And yes, we do go to 410, so we're great on time for questions. I just wanted to say at the start, thank you for sharing the information about the ARIA, especially the accessibility tree. I remember at a conference like this, I'd done some accessibility trainings before, and I know they had mentioned the accessibility tree, but I was at a training a couple of years after starting up at Pope Tech, and someone popped open that and showed how to use it just like you did. And it was like mind blown. I was like, wow, I can't
Yeah.
believe that's there and all this great information. And they were showing the wealth of things they could check that way. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. And thank you for the other great practical examples as well, too. If you had been posting, there are a lot of great conversations happening in the chat as well, too. If there was something in there that you wanted to make sure we brought into the Q&A, and please translate that over into the questions so we can tackle those. But we're just going to start here in the question and answer. And the first question by Nico was about how do you handle scenarios where using semantic HTMLs conflict with SEO needs? They went on to describe a scenario where the SEO wanted the long tail value from Google for their filters. Originally, these were coded as semantic checkboxes. They modified it to use styled anchor links that look like checkboxes using role equals checkbox, not ideal. And one of the few times they found semantic HTML didn't work. How would you answer that question? About that and that difference between there, and maybe there's some clarifications that you want to ask too that they could put in.
Yeah, it's a common problem. I will say that I am definitely not an SEO expert, so there may be some underlying, I guess, conversations that I would want to have with whoever is making those recommendations. I would be extremely surprised that SEO would prefer using ARIA in those cases. It doesn't seem like a good practice, in my opinion. So I would ask a lot of questions, I guess. So it's communicating essentially the same thing, right? So if you are using a semantic input of a type checkbox, that's communicating the same thing as role that is set to checkbox. So the SEO should parse that in the same way. The same information is being communicated in that way. So I would be surprised that would be the recommendation, to change those things to ARIA implementations when the HTML implementation has existed for a long time, right? That I feel like that would be the benchmark, not ARIA in those form element cases. That's maybe a non-answer, so I apologize. But so I would ask questions. I would push back on that a little bit because the HTML is always preferred. First rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA, right? So be very surprising if that's how like Google was building their algorithm, is to focus on ARIA. I'd be very surprised by that. I don't think that's a good idea. Let's put it that way.
Well, and I remember seeing one video about checkboxes, like if you create your own custom one, everything you had to do then to make it equivalent to what was just automatically there by using the semantic checkbox tags. So, definitely I agree with you. Ask lots of questions there and figure out why they're believing that. Can you think of any scenarios where there would be a tension between SEO and some of the semantic HTMLs?
Yeah, I know accessible name comes up a lot in the conversations with SEO professionals. That is definitely a big part of the algorithm, the mystery behind SEO, right? So I do know I have been asked previously to put ARIA labels onto links that provide more information. So it's the visible text, but also more information, because apparently the length of that accessible name, the specificity of it, ranks higher or something. Again, not an SEO expert, but I've heard that happening before. That can be something to look at. Again, though, I would just say if that comes up, front load that ARIA label with the visible text that is in the button or link or whatever it may be. Front load it in the ARIA label, then add whatever it is that you need to. The reason behind that is people using voice to activate links and buttons on your site are referencing the visuals, so they would have to guess at what the accessible name is if you mix the order of that. So that is the one thing I would keep in mind if that comes up.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for sharing that. Next question from Jen. Do you have any advice on using SVGs and how to code them so they are optimally accessible? We use many maps and visualizations charts, for instance, on our pages.
Yeah, that's a really big question. And I hate this answer, but it is going to depend on what you are displaying. You can make an SVG extremely accessible because at its core, it is HTML, right? It is very semantic HTML. So using the title inside of the SVG to give alternative text description, you could also put it, change it to a role of image with an ARIA label onto that. To provide that accessible name. People can also traverse the content of a very elaborate chart, for instance. I want to say it's HighChart that does it extremely well, that I've checked in the past. So I might just take a look at their examples and see kind of what their tricks are about some of that. You can make the text and information in SVG totally accessible and focusable. You can actually move through an SVG content with your keyboard, for instance. So that is there are maybe some places where it might be better to provide a really basic description of that and then provide HTML text that describes it as a story or as more detailed information too. So again, you might want to make that decision as a team. Sometimes that off-screen text or that HTML description is a little more user-friendly than trying to tab through a very interactive chart, for instance. But again, that's going to be your team conversation to decide which direction you want to go.
And definitely some great resources online for that as well too.
Mm-hmm.
But great question. We're going to keep moving through a couple more, see how many more we can get through on these. They're just coming in some awesome questions, so we'll see how many we can get to. But from David, I've been struggling to make the label to input connections when the input is contained in a web component because the ID doesn't cross the boundary of the shadow DOM. My solution thus far has been to use ARIA label on the input and to add visual only label for screens. Would that pass your code review, or is there a better solution?
Good question. Yeah. Excuse me. Really good question. Okay. I would say you might be making more work for yourself, just in the long term for maintenance. For instance, if you're doing that direction, you would very much have to double check that the visible text is matching the ARIA label value. You'd have to make sure that copy paste problem doesn't happen where the ARIA label never changes down the fields that you might put in your form. It's probably going to take you more effort to test and make sure those things are valid and important and descriptive to the end user. So I would probably, if ID is the problem, I would probably try that implicit label approach where you are wrapping the label around the input field, because again, you don't need unique IDs. That's a common problem if you are using a template, for instance, where you're repeating the same component down the page. Unique ID on all of those is very difficult, right? So you have to do a lot of scripting and counting to make that happen. So yeah, I would try the implicit label first. And if you have to do the ARIA label, just know that when you are doing your code review, you have to double check that those values match going down the fields and that it's communicating the same information to visual users and assistive technologies. So.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Let's just hit one more quick one. The next one at the top. Someone just asked, how do we access the accessibility tree? They're unfamiliar with code. Yeah. So I thought you might like that one. Great question.
Yes. So I'm gonna not switch screens and do a live demo because that's fraught with danger. But if you're in Chrome, for instance, you would go to the bar at the top and find Open DevTools. That opens up this panel that is actually still on the screen here. I have it in dark mode, so yours might look different. It might be in white mode. I don't know what you call that. The bright mode, normal mode. I have no idea, but that will open up this panel, and then you'll see on, let me see if I can get my mouse, on the left, this styles panel or on the right, the styles panel will be selected first, and you just have to use this arrow at that top of that right-hand panel to go find that accessibility tab, and it will show you this information. And then this view in the accessibility panel changes based on what you have selected in the HTML that is displayed on the left side. So you can see I'm highlighting the heading level 2 there. So the information that I am seeing in the accessibility panel on the right is related directly to, like, in scope to that heading level 2. So it's kind of handy that way. It's not, you can pop open the full thing. It's a little overwhelming. So I like to do it this way, where I pick an element and take a look at it at that level in the HTML.